In the heart of Princeton, New Jersey, nestled within the quiet embrace of old, tree-lined streets, stood St. Michael's Church, a place of solace and strength for its close-knit, deeply religious community. For years, Father James Whitaker had been the beloved priest, admired not only for his eloquent sermons but for his unwavering dedication to his parishioners. His deep brown eyes and gentle smile were often the first comfort for those troubled by life's burdens. To the people of Princeton, he was more than a priest, he was a symbol of kindness, a beacon of hope in their sometimes chaotic lives. Clara Whitaker, his wife, stood by his side, a pillar of grace and charity. Known for her beauty and selflessness, Clara was often seen organizing community events, from food drives to charity auctions. She poured herself into these projects with an energy that seemed endless, and her smile could light up even the darkest room. She was the perfect wife, always attentive, always loving, her loyalty to James unshakable. Together, they seemed untouchable, an embodiment of the ideal couple, the perfect family. But beneath the surface of this seemingly flawless life, there were cracks waiting to widen. Clara had her own private struggles, burdens she kept hidden from the world. She longed for the same deep connection with James that she saw in their shared mission, but over time, she began to feel an unsettling distance between them, an invisible wall she couldn't quite understand. She brushed it off at first, telling herself it was just the wear and tear of everyday life, but it gnawed at her. Something wasn't right. It was during this time of quiet unease that Isabel Moore, Clara's younger sister, entered their lives. Recently divorced, Isabel had come to Princeton seeking refuge from the emotional wreckage of her failed marriage. She was in her early 30s, beautiful, vibrant, but shattered by the loss of what she once thought was her future. After moving in with Clara, Isabel tried to regain a sense of normalcy, but the pain from her broken marriage lingered, clouding her every step. Clara welcomed her with open arms, eager to help her sister heal. Isabel's heart, heavy with the weight of grief, found comfort in Clara's support, but it was the quiet moments with Father James that gave her true peace. James was always there, listening. His compassion drew Isabel in, and his quiet strength offered her a kind of solace she hadn't known since her marriage fell apart. As the days passed, Isabel found herself looking forward to their conversations more than she cared to admit. She began confiding in him, telling him things she had never shared with anyone, her insecurities, her sense of inadequacy, her broken dreams. In turn, Father James shared his own burdens with her, the weight of his duties, the endless expectations placed upon him as a man of God, and the constant pressure to meet the needs of his congregation. They connected, deeply, on a level neither had anticipated. Their conversations evolved, moving from casual chats to intimate confessions. They would sit together in the late hours of the evening, long after Clara had gone to bed, sharing stories, dreams, and fears. The air between them grew thicker, the tension undeniable. What had started as a simple exchange of comfort began to feel dangerously intimate. Their laughter became softer, their glances longer. The line between friendship and something more blurred with each passing day. Isabel couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Father James. She was drawn to his kindness, to the way his eyes seemed to see her, truly see her, in a way no one else ever had. She found herself thinking about him even when he wasn't there. And yet, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was betraying Clara, the sister who had opened her home and heart to her during the darkest time in her life. Father James, too, began to feel the weight of their connection. Every moment they shared felt like a whisper in the dark, both comforting and dangerous. He knew the boundaries of their relationship, but with each passing day, he found them harder to maintain. There was something about Isabel, her vulnerability, her laughter, her raw honesty, that made it impossible to stay detached. He told himself it was just a fleeting connection, but deep down, he knew it was something far more complex. The bond between them grew, with every stolen glance, every lingering touch, and every shared vulnerability. It was a relationship neither of them could have foreseen, yet it felt like an inevitable collision. Neither could see the danger they were walking toward, but both sensed that their lives were about to change forever. And the storm was coming, though neither was yet ready to face it. The seeds of betrayal had been planted, and it would only take one fateful moment to make them bloom. As the days passed, Father James and Isabel's bond grew undeniably stronger. What had begun as innocent conversations in the quiet corners of the Whittaker home had slowly evolved into something more intimate, more dangerous. They found themselves drawn to each other in ways that neither of them had anticipated. There was a magnetic pull between them, something neither could ignore, but neither could quite understand either. Isabel, still reeling from the wreckage of her failed marriage, began to lean on James more and more. The nights felt quieter, lonelier without his comforting presence. She could feel herself growing emotionally dependent on him, his understanding and patience offering her something she hadn't had in years, someone who truly listened, who cared. In his presence, Isabel felt seen, heard, and, for the first time in a long while, valued. It wasn't just the conversations that held her, though, they were the moments in between, the lingering silences, the subtle smiles, the way his eyes would meet hers, just for a second too long. Father James found himself caught in a quiet storm of his own. He had taken vows to serve God, to guide his parishioners with integrity, and to live a life free of such distractions. Yet, there was something about Isabel that had begun to unravel him in ways he had never thought possible. She was not just another troubled soul needing advice, she was someone whose pain mirrored his own in ways he couldn't articulate. But it wasn't just that Isabel was suffering. It was the way she carried herself, the way she spoke about her past and her dreams, the raw emotion she revealed to him in their private moments. Father James had always been someone who found comfort in duty, in structure, but Isabel was a force of unpredictability in his world. She challenged him, made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. But with that newfound vitality came guilt. Each conversation they shared felt like an unwelcome temptation, each smile and every brush of their fingers felt like a betrayal of his calling, of the life he had vowed to live. Yet, with every encounter, the temptation became harder to ignore. Isabel noticed the change in Father James too. His words had always been filled with wisdom, but now they seemed to carry a subtle weight behind them, something unspoken yet palpable. The glances he shot her way, the careful way he seemed to protect her, even from herself, made her heart race with excitement, but also with a hint of guilt. She began to wonder whether he, too, felt the same pull. It was a dangerous line they were both walking, and each step forward felt like a descent into something that could no longer be undone. In the quiet nights, long after Clara had gone to bed, they would sit on the porch wrapped in blankets, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes and fears. What had started as casual conversations about their childhoods, about the pain of their pasts, grew more personal, more intimate. They began discussing not just their feelings of loss but their desires, their hopes for the future, and the sense of loneliness that seemed to follow them both, despite their outwardly full lives. Each conversation felt like an unspoken agreement, a shared acknowledgement of the forbidden connection between them. It was as if, in the act of confessing to one another, they were both seeking not just solace, but a way to justify the emotional ties that were deepening between them. James found himself longing for their late-night talks, feeling an ache in his chest when the conversations came to an end. The intimacy of their exchange created a space where he felt not like a priest, but like a man, flawed, vulnerable, and deeply human. Isabel's laugh, the light in her eyes when she spoke of her passions, her vulnerability as she revealed her innermost fears, became something he couldn't escape. The connection they shared, though still largely unspoken, was undeniable. It was magnetic. Every glance, every brush of skin, left them both breathless. It was in those moments that Isabel began to sense a shift in herself as well. What started as admiration and gratitude for Father James's kindness quickly morphed into something more. She found herself drawn to him in ways that went beyond mere friendship. There was something in the way he looked at her, something in the way his voice would soften when speaking with her, that made her heart beat faster. She wanted more than the fleeting moments of connection, they weren't enough. She craved him, the closeness, the chemistry that crackled between them every time they spoke. But she also knew that what they were doing was wrong. She loved her sister, and Clara had opened her heart and home to her when she needed it most. Isabel tried to push those feelings down, telling herself that it was nothing more than a fleeting connection, that the guilt she felt was an overreaction. But deep inside, she knew better. The truth was, she could no longer pretend. There was something between her and Father James, something powerful, dangerous, and, in many ways, inevitable. One evening, after a particularly long conversation about Isabel's fears for the future, the tension between them reached its breaking point. Father James caught her gaze, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The air between them became thick with the weight of everything they had shared, everything they had left unsaid. The silence was deafening, their hearts pounding in their chests, each aware of the lines they were crossing but too far gone to turn back. Then, as if on cue, they both moved at once. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, but quickly grew more urgent. It was a kiss filled with longing, confusion, and something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. They were no longer just two people seeking solace, they were two souls intertwined, caught in a whirlwind of desire and guilt. And once that kiss ended, they both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. What had begun as an innocent friendship had spiraled into an illicit affair, one that neither of them could control. From that moment on, their lives were no longer their own. They were drawn together, each meeting a stolen moment, each touch a new betrayal. The emotional bond that had started innocently had turned into something far more destructive, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before the consequences of their actions caught up with them. The days following their first kiss were a blur of emotions. Father James and Isabel tried to keep up appearances, both determined to maintain the facade of normalcy in front of Clara. But the air between them had shifted, thick with a new, unspoken understanding. Every glance exchanged in the presence of others felt laden with secrets, and every moment alone seemed charged with the weight of their undeniable attraction. Neither of them could pretend that things hadn't changed between them. They were no longer just the concerned priest and the grieving sister-in-law, they were something far more dangerous. The secret between them began to take root, a gnawing presence that lingered in the quiet corners of their lives. Their conversations became more frequent, more personal, and their late-night meetings became routine. What had once been an occasional meeting of shared grief had transformed into something darker, more consuming. In the silence of the Whittaker home, when Clara was asleep or out at a community event, Isabel and Father James would find themselves drawn together in ways they couldn't explain. Every stolen glance, every lingering touch, every word spoken in hushed tones only fueled the fire between them. Isabel found herself waking up every morning with thoughts of James filling her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently between them. She told herself that their connection was just a momentary lapse in judgment, that they had both been vulnerable, and that it had meant nothing. But every time they spoke, every time their eyes met, she felt that familiar pull again. Her heart would race, her breath would quicken, and she knew, deep down, that she was lying to herself. Father James, too, struggled to come to terms with what was happening. His life had always been about duty, his commitment to the church, his calling as a priest, and his responsibilities as a husband. But Isabel had shaken him to his core. The way she looked at him, the way she opened up to him, the way her presence made him feel something beyond the rigid walls of his duties, it was all too much to ignore. He had always thought of himself as a man of integrity, someone who could rise above temptation, but with Isabel, everything he believed in seemed to falter. Each time they were together, the connection between them deepened, and the temptation to cross the line grew stronger. They found themselves drawn into each other's orbit, caught in an emotional storm that neither could control. Father James tried to fight it, tried to focus on his responsibilities, but Isabel's smile, her laugh, the way she made him feel so seen and alive, had a magnetic pull that he couldn't resist. And Isabel, despite her better judgment, couldn't keep her distance. The feeling of being wanted, of being cared for in a way that her marriage had never allowed, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. The turning point came one evening after a particularly emotional conversation. They had been talking for hours, and by the time Clara had returned home, they were both too entangled in their emotions to pretend that nothing was happening. The tension between them was palpable, and as Clara entered the room, the sudden shift in the atmosphere didn't go unnoticed. Father James quickly pulled away, his heart pounding in his chest, as Isabel hurriedly stood up, her face flushed. Clara, who had been noticing the subtle changes in their relationship, felt an uneasy chill run down her spine. She didn't know it yet, but the trust she had placed in both her husband and her sister was about to be shattered. The momentary discomfort that she sensed between them was a mere hint of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. As Father James and Isabel exchanged a fleeting glance, each one knowing that the web they had woven together was now impossible to untangle, they both understood one thing: there was no turning back. Their first stolen kiss had been a catalyst, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Their secret affair now had a life of its own, like a fire that refused to be extinguished. Every time they met, every whispered conversation and lingering touch, they felt themselves slipping deeper into a world of deceit. They were no longer just two people with a connection, they were two people who had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Isabel, who had once been so adamant about maintaining boundaries, now found herself giving in to the pull of desire. Each stolen moment became more precious, more exhilarating. The guilt that initially gnawed at her began to dull, replaced by a feeling of intense longing. She was falling for James, and she couldn't stop it. For Father James, it was even more complicated. His life, built on the foundation of faith and service, had been upended by his emotions for Isabel. He tried to justify it to himself, told himself that they were both suffering, that their connection was a way of healing, but deep down, he knew he was betraying not just Clara, but his own vows. Every time he kissed Isabel, every time their hands brushed, every stolen embrace felt like a violation. But at the same time, it felt so right. Their affair became a tangled web of lies, guilt, and desire. Each day, they danced around the truth, avoiding Clara's suspicions and hiding their connection from the world. But even as they buried the truth, it festered beneath the surface, threatening to explode at any given moment. The affair was no longer a fleeting moment of weakness. It was now the defining feature of their relationship. And as the stakes grew higher, so did the risk. Every secret they shared, every touch they exchanged, brought them closer to a moment of reckoning that neither of them could escape. And yet, despite the mounting guilt and the looming consequences, neither Father James nor Isabel could walk away. The pull between them was too strong, too consuming. They were trapped in a cycle of love, lust, and betrayal, a cycle that would ultimately lead to a tragedy neither of them could have foreseen. The dangerous dance of their secret affair had begun, and there was no way to predict how far it would go, or what the devastating fallout would be. Clara had always been intuitive, able to read people and situations with an accuracy that bordered on uncanny. It wasn't just the way she could tell when someone was upset or hiding something, it was the small, almost imperceptible changes she noticed in her husband and sister. In the weeks leading up to the moment she discovered the truth, she had sensed a shift in both of them, a subtle distance that grew with each passing day. But it wasn't until one quiet afternoon, as she was cleaning the kitchen, that the weight of her suspicions became undeniable. Father James had been distant for weeks. At first, Clara chalked it up to the demands of his work. As the parish priest, James had always been busy, often disappearing for long hours to attend to his duties. But this time, there was something different in his behavior. He was distracted, lost in thought even when he was home, often barely listening when Clara spoke to him. His once attentive nature had dulled, replaced by an eerie preoccupation with something, or someone, else. Isabel, too, had changed. She had always been a bit fragile after her divorce, but there was something in her eyes now that Clara couldn't quite place. The bright energy she once had was dimming, replaced by a quiet sadness that seemed to follow her everywhere. There were moments when Clara caught Isabel looking at James in a way that made her uncomfortable. It was subtle, but it was there, an intimacy in the way they spoke to each other, the way their gazes lingered a little too long. Clara had tried to push her doubts aside. She didn't want to believe that her sister, the one person she trusted most in the world, could betray her in such a way. She didn't want to believe that her husband, the man she had loved for over a decade, could possibly be hiding something so devastating. But the small signs were there, and Clara's gut told her that something was wrong. That afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen, Clara picked up James's phone from the counter. It had been buzzing constantly for the past few minutes, each notification more persistent than the last. She hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the screen. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but something in her told her that if she didn't check, she would never know the truth. What she found wasn't just a message, it was a thread. A thread of messages between James and Isabel, filled with heart emojis, flirtatious words, and declarations of longing. Clara's breath hitched in her throat as her heart pounded in her chest. The words blurred together as her mind tried to process what she was seeing. It felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only the deafening sound of her own heartbeat. This couldn't be real. It had to be some mistake. But the more Clara read, the more she understood. The messages spoke of secret meetings, whispered conversations, and stolen moments. Each text felt like a stab in the chest, each one more painful than the last. It was clear, James and Isabel were having an affair, and Clara had been living in a lie. The shock was overwhelming, but it wasn't just the betrayal that rocked her. It was the realization that her entire world, the life she had built with James, was a lie. All the love, all the trust, all the years they had spent together, it was all shattered in an instant. Clara dropped the phone, her hands trembling as she backed away from the counter. The world around her seemed to spin, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse. The anger, the hurt, the disbelief all crashed over her at once. She wanted to scream, to shout, to confront James and Isabel right then and there. But instead, she stood frozen, paralyzed by the weight of the truth. How could they do this to her? To their family? The questions flooded her mind in an endless stream, but there was no answer that could make sense of the betrayal she had just uncovered. It wasn't just the affair, it was the lies, the secrecy, the complete disregard for her trust. For years, Clara had given everything to her marriage, to her family, and this is how they repaid her. She thought of Isabel, her sister, the one person she had welcomed into her home, the one person she had tried to help rebuild her life after her failed marriage. She had opened her heart to Isabel, given her a place to stay, a sense of stability. And this was how Isabel repaid her. The bitterness tasted sharp in her mouth, and a wave of nausea swept over her. But it was James who hurt the most. He was her husband, the man she had pledged her life to, the one who had promised to love and cherish her. How could he do this to her? How could he look her in the eye every day, pretending everything was fine, while secretly betraying her in the most intimate way? Clara felt the ground beneath her shift, as if the very foundation of her life was crumbling. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. Her mind raced with thoughts of confrontation, of tearing the truth out of them both. But the fear of what would happen next, paralyzed her. What would this mean for their family? For their lives? It took everything in Clara to steady her breath, to pull herself together. She knew she couldn't face James or Isabel right now, not until she was ready. Not until she could process the chaos swirling inside her. But one thing was certain, she would confront them. She would demand answers. And no matter how much it hurt, she would make them face the consequences of their actions. The moment had come. The truth had been uncovered. And Clara's world would never be the same. The silence in the house was unbearable. Clara sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the phone in her hands. She had spent hours replaying everything, revisiting every conversation, every moment she had shared with James and Isabel, searching for clues, for signs she had missed. How had she been so blind? How had she trusted them both so completely, only for them to shatter that trust so easily? Her mind raced, but there was one thought that stood out among the chaos: she had to confront them. She couldn't live in this lie any longer. Clara knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The storm she had feared for so long was finally here, and there was no turning back. She had uncovered the truth, and now she had to face the people who had betrayed her in the worst possible way. The afternoon passed in a blur. Clara found herself pacing the house, her thoughts a swirl of anger and confusion. What should she say? How could she make them understand the depth of the pain they had caused her? Her emotions were raw, a volatile mix of rage, hurt, and disbelief. Every time she thought of James, her husband, the man she had given so much of herself to, her heart shattered again. And Isabel, her sister, the woman she had loved and trusted more than anyone else, had crossed a line she could never forgive. Clara had always prided herself on her ability to stay calm in a crisis. She had kept the family together through difficult times, made difficult decisions when she needed to. But now, in the face of the ultimate betrayal, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. Was she still the woman who had stood by her husband's side, who had fought for their family? Or was she now someone else entirely, a woman scarred by betrayal, forced to reckon with the ugly truth? She didn't have much time to think. The door creaked open, and she turned to see James standing in the doorway. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, as if he already knew something was wrong. His eyes darted nervously to the phone in her hand. He must have seen the look on her face, the look of a woman who had lost all trust in him. "Clara, what's going on?" James's voice was soft, but Clara could hear the uncertainty in his tone. He didn't know yet that the truth was out. He didn't know that his world was about to collapse. "Don't play dumb with me, James," Clara said, her voice cold and steady despite the storm inside her. She stood up, meeting his gaze. "I know everything." James froze, his eyes widening. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He opened his mouth to say something, but Clara silenced him with a sharp look. "I know about the messages, the late-night meetings," she continued, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "I know about the affair." James's face drained of color. He took a step toward her, but Clara held up her hand, stopping him in his tracks. "No, don't," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't come near me. I don't want to hear your excuses. I've heard enough." Father James lowered his head, guilt and shame washing over him. He opened his mouth again, but Clara spoke over him. "You think I wouldn't notice?" Clara's voice grew stronger, more accusing. "You think I wouldn't see the way you've been treating me? The way you've treated Isabel? The way you've been pulling away from me, day by day? I knew something was wrong, but I refused to believe it. And now, here we are." Her heart felt like it was being torn in two, each word cutting deeper than the last. But there was no turning back now. She had to face the truth, even if it hurt more than anything she had ever known. James finally spoke, his voice cracked with regret. "Clara, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. Isabel and we got caught up in something we couldn't control. I swear, it didn't mean anything at first, but it—" "Stop," Clara interrupted, her eyes blazing with hurt. "You don't get to make excuses. You don't get to tell me that it didn't mean anything. You've broken every vow we made to each other. Every promise." The words stung, but Clara felt a strange sense of relief as she spoke them. Finally, she was speaking the truth, no longer hiding behind the false comfort of denial. "And Isabel," she said, her voice rising with emotion. My own sister. I took her in, I gave her a home when she needed it, and this is what I get? I trusted you both. Tears welled up in her eyes, but Clara refused to let them fall. She had cried enough. This wasn't a moment for weakness. This was her life, and it was falling apart because of their choices. James, looking utterly defeated, sank down onto the edge of the bed. I never wanted to hurt you, Clara. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. Clara took a step back, her hands shaking. A mistake? A mistake is spilling coffee on your shirt. What you did, what both of you did, is beyond a mistake. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had heard enough. She had reached her breaking point. Clara's gaze hardened as she looked at her husband. I want you to leave, she said, her voice unwavering. I need space. I need time to think. And I don't want to see either of you right now. James opened his mouth to protest, but Clara held up her hand again. No. You've made your choices. And now I'm making mine. She turned away from him, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had just uncovered. The decisions ahead of her were ones she never thought she would have to make. But Clara knew something deep inside her, she couldn't forgive this. Not right now. Maybe not ever. As she walked out of the room, leaving James to sit there, broken and silent, Clara felt a strange sense of clarity. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she knew she was doing what was best for her. The road ahead would be painful, but she was ready to face it. The life she had known was gone, but Clara had just taken the first step toward reclaiming her own. The days following the confrontation were some of the most agonizing of Clara's life. She had asked James to leave their home, demanding that he give her space to think, to process the betrayal that had shattered her world. She wasn't sure if she was making the right decision, but the pain of his infidelity was too much to bear. As much as she loved him, something had irrevocably changed between them. She couldn't just pick up the pieces and pretend nothing had happened. Clara spent her time in isolation, grappling with the harsh reality of the situation. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and empty. Every room reminded her of the lies, of the love that had been twisted into something unrecognizable. She couldn't escape the memories of James and Isabel, of their stolen moments, their whispered words. The emotional weight was suffocating. Meanwhile, James and Isabel were no longer hiding their affair, but neither were they free of their guilt. The tension between them grew as the days passed, each of them aware of the consequences of their actions. Their secret, once so thrilling, had now become a burden. The fear of being caught gnawed at them relentlessly, but they couldn't stop. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. It wasn't long before the guilt and fear of exposure became too much to bear. On one fateful evening, after a particularly heated argument between the two, James and Isabel found themselves alone, trapped by the weight of their decisions. The fear of Clara revealing the truth to the community, of losing everything they had worked for, became an overwhelming force. Isabel, in a panic, suggested they do whatever it took to stop Clara from exposing them. At first, James resisted, horrified by the thought of what they might do to her. But the more they discussed it, the more the idea seemed to take root. They were backed into a corner, both of them terrified of the fallout from Clara's discovery. They realized that if Clara went to the police, or worse, to the parish leaders, their lives would be destroyed. The shame, the loss of everything they held dear, was something neither of them could bear. In that moment of desperation, they made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was late at night when they put their plan into motion. Clara, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster she had been riding for the past few days, was still awake, pacing around the house. The sounds of her footsteps echoed through the empty rooms, her mind racing with thoughts of how to move forward. Could she ever forgive James? Could their marriage ever be salvaged? These questions weighed heavily on her heart, but as the night wore on, she began to feel the crushing weight of loneliness, of betrayal, and of heartbreak. The knock on the door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. When she opened it, there stood James, his face weary but filled with a strange, unsettling intensity. "Clara, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and insistent. Clara's heart raced. She wasn't sure she was ready for this, but she had to face him, to confront the man who had destroyed their life together. Clara stepped back, allowing him into the house. "What is it, James?" Her voice trembled, but she held her ground. She could see the guilt in his eyes, but there was something more now, a sense of panic, of desperation. "We need to clear the air," he said, though his words didn't match the tension in his body. "Let's go for a drive. Somewhere quiet, away from everything. We can talk this through. I owe it to you." Clara hesitated. She wasn't sure what he meant by "talk this through," but something about his demeanor made her uneasy. Her instincts screamed at her to be cautious, but the part of her that still loved him, the part that wanted answers, drove her forward. She agreed to go. James led her to his car, and Isabel, hiding in the shadows, slipped into the back seat, her heart pounding. This was the moment. They had to do this now, before Clara could turn everything upside down. As they drove through the winding roads of Princeton, the tension in the car grew palpable. Clara, sensing something was wrong, looked at James. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James didn't answer at first. He kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Isabel, seated in the back, clenched her fists, her mind racing. This was the moment they had been dreading. They reached an isolated spot near a river, a place where few would ever venture at night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the surrounding trees. James parked the car, and for a moment, the three of them sat in silence. Clara looked at James, feeling the cold distance between them. Something wasn't right. "Clara," James finally said, his voice low, almost pleading. "I've made a terrible mistake. We've both made mistakes. But this is for the best. You'll see, in time. I'm sorry." Clara felt her heart race, fear creeping up her spine. "What are you saying, James? What is going on?" She began to piece it together, her suspicions were correct. He and Isabel weren't just having an affair. This was something far darker. Before she could react, Isabel lunged at her, grabbing her arms, pulling her into a struggle. Clara fought back, her survival instincts kicking in. "Let go of me," she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. The scene was chaotic, the desperate struggle between them escalating. In a blind panic, James joined in, helping Isabel restrain Clara. The panic in his eyes mirrored his desperation. He couldn't let Clara ruin their lives, couldn't let her expose them to the world. As Clara fought for her life, the two of them acted out of fear, out of a desperate need to protect themselves from the consequences of their actions. The confrontation turned brutal. Clara, disoriented and terrified, struggled to break free, but they overpowered her. In the heat of the moment, as fear and rage clouded their judgment, they made a decision that would forever alter the course of their lives. Clara's lifeless body was dumped by the riverbank, arranged to look as though she had fallen into the water during the struggle. It was a staged accident, a story they both hoped would protect them from the consequences of their actions. But in their haste to cover up their crime, they had sealed their fate. The night was still, the only sound the rushing of the river, as they drove back, hearts heavy with guilt and fear. They had done the unthinkable, and now, there was no going back. The web of lies and betrayal they had woven would soon unravel, leaving behind a wake of tragedy, guilt, and regret. The night Clara's body was found felt surreal to those who knew her. The small community of Princeton, New Jersey, had been rocked by the discovery of her lifeless form at the riverbank. Initially, the police labeled the incident as a tragic accident. The scene appeared convincing enough. Clara's body had been discovered in the water, twisted awkwardly, as though she had lost her footing while walking too close to the river. There were no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest foul play, at least, nothing obvious at first glance. But for those who knew Clara, the circumstances didn't sit right. Clara had always been cautious, meticulous. She wasn't the type to wander into dangerous waters in the middle of the night. Her friends, her neighbors, and especially her family, began to question the details of the discovery. Clara wasn't just another face in the community, she was a beloved figure, known for her warmth and generosity. The suddenness of her death, and the strange way it had happened, set off alarm bells in the minds of those who had known her best. As the investigation began, detectives quickly discovered inconsistencies in the initial reports. The first to speak up were Clara's closest friends, who recalled overhearing increasingly tense conversations between Clara and James in the days leading up to her death. They mentioned that Clara had been particularly troubled, almost as if she knew something was wrong but couldn't put it into words. There were also rumors of arguments, heated exchanges between James and Clara, and whispers of an unhealthy distance growing between them. Detectives started to dig deeper into Clara's social media accounts and text messages, looking for any clues that might suggest foul play. What they found was chilling. Clara had sent a series of texts to a close friend just days before her death, expressing concern about James's behavior. She had suspected something was off in their marriage, but she hadn't been able to fully grasp what it was. There were also subtle references in her messages about Isabel, her sister. Clara had hinted at a growing unease between her and Isabel, though she hadn't yet pieced everything together. She had even mentioned feeling suffocated by the secrets in her marriage. The more the detectives uncovered, the more troubling it became. Clara's fears had been justified, but her suspicions hadn't been fully formed. She hadn't known just how deep the betrayal went. And now, the detective was beginning to see a pattern emerging, a pattern that pointed directly to the people closest to Clara, James and Isabel. Detectives began to interview Isabel and James, each of them separately. At first, their stories were nearly identical, both describing the events leading up to Clara's death with eerie similarity. Both claimed that Clara had been upset recently, but neither could provide much detail. James told the detectives that he had been at home the night of the incident, preparing for an upcoming sermon, while Isabel claimed she had been resting at home. But there was something off in their demeanor. Both of them seemed overly calm, too composed for people who had just lost someone they loved. There was an unnatural tension in their words, as though they were both holding something back. It wasn't long before the detectives found the smoking gun. During the investigation, they uncovered a series of text messages exchanged between James and Isabel. The messages were filled with declarations of love, desperate pleas for secrecy, and plans to meet in the shadows. The two of them had been in a secret affair for weeks, their bond growing deeper with each passing day. But it wasn't just the affair that was damning, it was the final set of messages exchanged between them on the night Clara died. "Clara's getting too close," James had texted Isabel. "She's asking too many questions. We can't let her ruin everything." Isabel's response was chilling, "I can't lose everything. We can't let her expose us. We have to stop her." That night, the truth was laid bare. The affair was no longer a hidden secret, it was a premeditated crime. Clara's death had not been an accident. It had been planned, orchestrated out of fear and desperation. The detectives now had enough evidence to charge both James and Isabel with murder. As the police brought them in for questioning, both James and Isabel initially denied any involvement in Clara's death. They claimed they were being framed, that they had no idea what had happened. But the weight of the evidence against them was too much to deny. Their lies began to unravel, each attempt at a new excuse falling apart under the scrutiny of the detectives' relentless questioning. James, finally breaking down, admitted that he had been having an affair with Isabel for weeks, and in a moment of panic, they had both decided to silence Clara. She had been getting too close to the truth, asking too many questions, and they feared that she would expose them to the entire community. They had planned the entire thing, luring Clara into the car under the guise of a reconciliation, driving her to the secluded spot by the river, and then overpowering her. They had thought they could stage it as an accident, but their plan had been sloppy, their execution even worse. The detectives found fingerprints on a broken object at the scene, evidence that didn't match Clara's. They also found traces of Isabel's clothing near Clara's body, further implicating her in the crime. With the truth finally out, the community was left reeling. The people who had once trusted Father James, the man of God they had admired, now saw him for what he truly was, a murderer. Isabel, the sister who had been welcomed into Clara's home with open arms, was now revealed to be the catalyst of a deadly betrayal. The trial was swift and brutal. As the evidence against them piled up, the jury found James and Isabel guilty of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The court sentenced them both to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The once untouchable figures in the community, the beloved priest and his sister-in-law, were now nothing more than criminals who had destroyed a family, their lives forever altered by the choices they had made in a moment of desperation. The aftermath was even more devastating. St. Michael's Church, once a sanctuary of peace, was now a place of scandal. The congregation that had once adored James now turned their backs on him, the stain of his actions too great to wash away. Many left the church, unable to reconcile the man of God they had trusted with the monster he had become. Isabel's family, too, was torn apart. Clara's parents, devastated by the loss of their daughter, could not fathom that their own flesh and blood had played a part in her death. Isabel, once the daughter they had hoped would heal from her past, was now a pariah, shunned by everyone who had once loved her. The tragic death of Clara Whitaker left a void in the lives of everyone who knew her. Her murder wasn't just a loss of life, it was the end of everything she had built. The betrayal of her husband and sister, the devastating loss of her future, left those who were left behind asking how far a single lie could destroy a family. And for James and Isabel, the consequences of their affair and their crime were only just beginning. The final verdict was handed down quickly. James Whitaker and Isabel Moore were both convicted of murder and conspiracy to commit murder, their betrayal of Clara sealed by the overwhelming evidence against them. The once trusted priest and the woman who had been welcomed into Clara's home with open arms were now nothing more than criminals. The life they had built, cloaked in lies, secrets, and forbidden love, had come crashing down, leaving only wreckage in its wake. James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His once admired reputation as a man of faith was destroyed in a single act of cruelty. His former parishioners, who had come to him for solace and guidance, now turned their backs on him. His status as a priest was revoked, and St. Michael's Church, the institution that had once been the foundation of his life, now felt like a hollow shell. The community that had once trusted him felt the sting of betrayal deeply, and many abandoned their faith altogether, unable to reconcile the man of God they had admired with the murderer he had become. Isabel, too, was sentenced to life in prison. The woman who had once been Clara's sister-in-law, who had come to her for refuge, was now a pariah. The love she had once shared with James had torn her apart, and her role in Clara's murder had erased any semblance of the woman she had once been. Her parents, who had welcomed her into their lives after her divorce, were now left grieving the daughter they never truly knew. They couldn't fathom that their own flesh and blood had played such a part in the tragedy that unfolded. The devastation extended far beyond the courtroom. Clara's parents, already grieving the loss of their daughter, were now left with the unbearable reality that not only had they lost their child, but the betrayal had come from within their own family. Clara's siblings, once close-knit and loving, were now fractured beyond repair. They could never look at Isabel the same way again. The damage to their family, to their bonds, was irreparable. For the Whitaker family, the aftermath was no less painful. Clara's death had torn apart a marriage, destroyed a family, and obliterated the life they had once shared. James, the man who had vowed to love and cherish his wife, had broken that promise in the most devastating way possible. And now, he had to face the consequences of his choices, a lifetime in prison, stripped of the very thing that had once defined him, his faith. But even more than the loss of their physical lives and futures, there was the deeper, more lasting cost of the betrayal. Trust, once broken, can never fully be repaired. The psychological and emotional scars left on everyone involved would linger long after the trial ended. Friends, family, and the community had all been irrevocably changed by the choices of two people who couldn't control their desires. It was a reminder of the fragility of relationships and the profound impact that a single moment of weakness can have. The truth was, there were no winners in this story. Clara, the innocent victim, paid the ultimate price for a betrayal she never deserved. The people who once loved James and Isabel now had to live with the knowledge of their actions. And the lasting impact of Clara's death left everyone involved with unanswered questions. How could something so devastating happen in a place of trust and faith? How could people who seemed so perfect on the outside harbor such dark secrets within? And most importantly, what does it take to rebuild from such destruction? As the dust settled, the question of how to move forward remained unanswered. For the people of Princeton, the tragic events were a stark reminder of the dangers of secrecy, of the darkness that can lurk behind the walls of seemingly perfect lives. The community would never be the same. St. Michael's Church, once a place of solace, now stood as a haunting reminder of the consequences of betrayal. The lives of those involved had been shattered, their futures forever altered by the choices they made in moments of weakness. As we come to the end of this tragic tale, we're left with a powerful question: what makes a person betray someone they love, and what drives people to make such irreversible decisions? Could Clara have done anything to prevent her tragic end? Could James and Isabel have ever seen the consequences of their actions before it was too late? These are questions that many of us will never truly have answers to. But the real lesson here is that betrayal is a powerful force, and it can destroy more than just relationships, it can destroy lives. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it can never fully be mended. What do you think about this story? Do you think there were signs that could have been caught earlier? Or do you think the betrayal was inevitable? How would you have handled the situation if you were Clara? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and let us know what you think about the choices made by the characters in this story. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this, and share your opinions with us. We value your thoughts and would love to continue the conversation. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes, the darkest secrets are hidden in the most unexpected places.